This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living Catholic, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor of Sacred Heart Parish and rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother. As we begin this new year, it pays to look ahead and to see what looms out of the darkness of the future. It's a popular thing to do at this time of the year. Everybody wants to try to get a step ahead of everyone else when it comes to getting up in the morning and leaning into the day, even if it's only a matter of having the right opinion first and nothing more. We like to be able to pull the curtain back on what's going to happen. It's not a bad temptation, and it's certainly not unnatural. And everybody's first method for discerning the future is to look back at what has happened, and that puts us in the oddly positioned process of walking forward by glancing back over our shoulders. But it seems to be how we're programmed. After all, everything that happens in our world has its antecedents in the past. Every occurrence has a precedence we can trace. Nothing simply appears out of nothing with no thread connecting before to after. We figure then if we can look at yesterday closely enough, we'll figure out a bit about tomorrow. Even though we know we're surrounded by the phenomenon of the unknowable in our futures, we still figure we'll learn by casting back. Look at, say, 9/11. When the dawn broke on that morning in 2001, no one anywhere was expecting anything different in New York City. By noon, every notion of ourselves and our culture had been altered. At least part of the shock of it all was that we never imagined it could happen, that a small cabal of terrorists could hijack planes and then fly them into skyscrapers. And yet it did happen. And when we started looking into it, we found the threads that went back to the 1920s and the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood. The threads were all there. If we picked at them from 2001, they twitched virtually throughout the entire previous century. So it only makes sense to imagine that if we could have just identified those threads lying about at that time, we could identify the threads lying about in our world today, and we could see what might be woven into the future. At least that's what we think. The truth of the matter is that tomorrow is unknown to all of us. Predictions are hard to make, especially about the future. Some can be dead on, like the anxieties about our infrastructure problems. Some can be vaguely coherent, like the rumblings about climate change. And some are dead wrong, like, our notions about flying cars or the new age of democracy in the Middle East or the threat of AIDS. Each of them had their precedents and had their own tendrils in the past, but none of them ended up woven into our futures. Alas, we're left with trying to imagine the world as it might be. There's nothing wrong with that, of course, and there are plenty of people who have been singularly good at such things. The problem is they're known as novelists, not realists. What we want is to feel like we're getting a real peek at what actually lies there just below the horizon of tomorrow, so that when the world turns a bit, we'll be able to recognize its outlines and to be the first to see it. We don't particularly want simple flights of fancy. They can be entertaining, but they don't satisfy the hunger for first sight. Although you have to admit, say, the Oklahoma City bombing or 9/11 or the war in Ukraine or the Gaza terrorism attacks or our military recruiting shortfall and the COVID outbreak, they were all written about by novelists in pretty good detail before they happened. I know because I read them. It's funny how it goes. When our imaginations are prodded by the possibilities of today, we can paint a pretty good picture of tomorrow. Over and over again, it has been done. In his novel about the future set in 1995, the novelist Robert Hugh Benson wrote in 1895 in his novel The Lord of the World, he wrote that there would be air flights between London and Rome that would allow a person to speak in one place in the morning, hop on a flight, then speak at another in the evening. He also imagined a version of TV, an international viewing audience, an Air Force attack squadron, the UN, euthanasia clinics, mercy killing, and government tracking of all of its citizens. That's from 1895. It's breathtaking to read. Nobody thought of him as a prophet when the book was published, and it turned out he got a lot of things right. Of course, not all things. Well, at least not yet. But no one bought his book in 1895 to see what 1896 was going to be like. And certainly nobody in 1896, having read his book, could have imagined Britain as it was in, say, 1918 or 1940 or 1980, much less Britain today. The glimpse into the future was more like rolling the dice. If you roll long enough, you're bound to hit every possible combination of numbers and every possible combinations of numbers in sequence. It's only a matter of how much time and energy there is to invest. And besides, no one throwing dice is particularly interested in the fact that different particular numbers can come up at each throw. They're interested in knowing which particular number will appear at each throw. Knowing that, you have valuable information. It's like Richard Feynman talking about randomness. He would come into his physics class and say something like, "You wouldn't believe this, but I saw a car tag today on my way to work. It was SHG 7589. Now, what are the chances that I would see that particular combination of letters and numbers?" And the answer is, the chances are 1 in 176 million. But those long odds collapse in the face of the fact that the car tag was there in front of him at the stoplight. Imagining and predicting are two kinds of things. What we want is prediction, and that's hard. As believers, we have a special relationship to the future. And I mean by that we're not simply like the person who looks up to see what will pass and what will last in the years to come. When we're just buckled in, we see what will swirl up among us. We're simply waiting on the rise and the fall and rise again of the energies of the world. In the ancient world, they called it fortuna, and they imagined it as a kind of spinning wheel. Sometimes you're up, sometimes you're down. But whatever happens, you can depend on the fact that things will not remain the same because all things change. And there's no rhyme or reason to the changes other than the fickleness of fortune. True, some of us have a better time of it than others, but that's just part of the prickly nature of this particular aspect of our humanity. Of all of the characteristics, for example, that Napoleon prized in his commanders, he valued luck most of all. Being in the right place at the right time with the right things, especially if such an arrangement is the product of blind chance. That's the gift of fortune. He wanted those who were bestowed with such gifts to be his commanders. And while we don't usually acknowledge it, this is what we observe when we obsessively look at the news. The rush of adulation, followed by the crash of obscurity. That's the movement of fortune. Who's up, who's down, who wins, who loses. All of this is fortune at work in our world. And we're fascinated by it. We can't get enough of it. Not just the winners, but we're also captivated by the losers. We know how things go. There's no abyss so profound somebody can't find his way out of it. Conversely, there is no success or high point somebody can't fall away from. Each is a story we love to hear. Most of the time, we can't wait to find out what's in the next chapter. It propels our news cycle. It feeds the maw of the modern media. We all want to find out who's going to be the next winner and the next loser, for they are bound to come. Time is simply the means by which these things take place. It's the frame on which we can attach the various personalities and actors as they fill our view. While we generally view the world as vaguely progressing from one thing to another, it does so only by the shambling, stumbling catfight of personal ups and downs. If we're asked, we're certain the current hype about one person or another is the most critical or the most important there is at the moment, which is why we pay so much attention to them. But if we were to take our interest in those situations and those people's today and apply it to some moment in the past, say from, 50 years ago, we'd find the people of the time saying the same thing about the same kind of person with the same level of interest, which means the names change and the circumstances are altered. But whether it's from 50 years ago or today, the energy is the same. We're captivated by the power of this energy to hold us poised and bound right now at this moment. We believers, however, are not to be held captive by this kind of power. In fact, when we abjure the power of this world, we also say no to the powers at work among us in this way. We know the true power in this world lies in the will of God at work, not in the fascination with the personalities or the probabilities of people. What does it say in the Scriptures? Put your trust not in princes, This is the admonition we operate according to. Who's up and who's down, who's winning and who's losing, they're all too variable and too weak for any of our trust. If we do place our chips there and bet on that one thing, we're bound to be disappointed. Just look around. Everyone who does, no matter which prince they're backing, ends up being disappointed. We don't have to talk about politicians in order to get the message. It's just as true as if we're focused on fame and celebrity, about accumulating money or prestige or power, or if we've decided the stock exchange is our gateway to happiness. If that's where we've decided the future lies, in any of those things, and we're invested there as the end-all and be-all, we're going to be disappointed as we come up short. There's a good account of this in the Old Testament in an unexpectedly modern story. We might not recognize it for what it is, but it speaks directly to us. It's the account of Aaron, the brother of Moses, and the golden calf. We all know the story. The Israelites had been led out of slavery and into the desert by Moses. Pharaoh's army comes after them to correct the error of letting them go and comes after them to bring them back into slavery. The people are afraid, but Moses appeals to God and they escape, crossing through the Red Sea, leaving behind their chariots and horses of the military force sent to corral them. And as they come along the pathway through the sea, the water closes over the troops and horses of Egypt, and they are drowned, leading to the passage sung by Miriam, Moses' sister, which scholars believe, for a variety of reasons, is the oldest written passage in the Bible. It's, "Sing to the Lord, for he is gloriously triumphant. Horse and chariot he has cast into the sea. All is glorious victory." Moses goes up the mountain to consult with God then, and while he's gone, people begin to grouse about his absence, about the uncertainty of their new position. After all, they're now a free people, but they don't have a direction or a land. They're still waiting to find out what's going to happen to them. And all that has taken place for them, simply the prelude to bringing them out into the desert. They don't know what's going to happen, and they're not happy with where they are. Everything is up in the air for them. Remember, this is after the miracles they've seen and have been a part of. The plagues in Egypt, the destroying angel, the dividing of the Red Sea, the escape from the pursuing army, all of these things had happened in front of them. In addition, Moses was gone. He had disappeared up on the mountain of God, and there was no certainty about when he was coming back. It was, for them, anxiety, confusion, and fear. So they went to Aaron and told him. And they told him to make them a god that they could worship. In response, Aaron said, "Well, fine, I have the recipe." And we should notice that this happens immediately. There was no hesitation on Aaron's part, because the truth of the matter is, we all have the recipe. And it goes like this. Aaron told everyone to file past this large cauldron so that each person could put their gold rings in it, earrings or nose rings. And each person, when they had done this, they contributed from their store of wealth and identity, and the gold was melted down and then formed into a golden calf. A calf was one of the images of one of the local gods popular at the time. And when it was all done, Aaron stood and announced, "Israel, here is your God." At that, the people began to dance and make merry, according to the Scriptures. Now, pay attention. Aaron did not pass the evening and then come out of the tent in front of the community and present them with a statue that he claimed came down from heaven in the arms of angels, so that the people could be sure that their God loved them and wanted them to be sure and certain in their lives. He didn't claim the statue had been discovered buried in the sand, provided to the people in their time of need by the outworking of a caring God who wanted to be sure his people would be pacified and cared for. There was no pretense about divinity or holiness or transcendence at all. He did all of this, melted the gold, formed the calf, in front of everyone. Everyone had their own personal buy-in. There was no room for mistaken attribution or for fudging the story of what happened. To create a God is no big mystery. All it takes is to have the people do it. It's a vote on who's up and who's down, on who's winning and who's losing. And it's not anything else. To create a God for people to follow is the easiest thing in the world. Apparently, the recipe is ingrained in our thought processes. Now, of course, Moses comes down from the mountain and confronts the people. He's amazed to find them abandoning the grace of God that has brought them so far so quickly. He chases the people away from the giant fiesta they're having. He condemns those who led this request for finding a new God, and he grinds the calf into gold dust, throws the dust on the water, and has each person come by and drink the water and the dust. Finally, he turns to Aaron and asks how he could have done such a thing. In the version from the book of Deuteronomy, Aaron responds with the explanation we all understand. He tells Moses that he put all of the gold from the people in a cauldron, and it was as if this golden calf popped out on its own, which is pretty much how it happens. Get the people together in their hunger, provide them with a solution, and suddenly everybody's paying attention. Everybody's agreeing on what they see, and then everybody's bowing down before what they themselves have invented. Just looking around at our politics or business or the military and our campuses, and we see it's just as true now as it was in the desert at the base of Mount Sinai. Our attention is captivated by what comes out of the cauldron boiling in front of us. And the point of this vignette in the Bible is to remind us of how this happens. It occurs in our lives over and over again. We don't have to be Israelites on our way to the Promised Land in order for our attention to wander and our focus to fade. The blurry lines of our disappearing commitments virtually define us. And because no matter where we've come from or what has happened in our lives, even if it has been miraculous and incredible and amazing, with all that has been God's grace in every way and by every measure, we're always liable to imagine our next God will pop out of the cauldron in front of us, and we'll go chasing after it with all of the energy we can muster. But as believers, we're promised that we're on our way somewhere. We're not just by ourselves. No matter how much we might get sidetracked, we're on the pathway to fulfill the promise of God's kingdom among us. When Jesus first came among the people, he proclaimed as his first announcement that he was fulfilling the promise of God and providing the new initiative of God to his people. It was a new day and a new time for all of humanity, and he was present in order that it might come about. As John Shea remarked, at first people heard that Jesus was announcing that the kingdom was coming. Then they understood that it had arrived, and then they saw that Jesus was the kingdom that had come. He was the good news they were waiting for. Ultimately, in the last part of his ministry with his apostles, Jesus gathered them at the Last Supper and promised them that they would receive him, they would become him. And as they did what he was doing in the breaking of the bread and the passing of the cup, take this and eat, he said, "This is me. Take this and drink, this is me." His presence would be in them and among all those who were there to receive what he offered. With the coming of the kingdom of God in Christ, it meant that to enter into the presence of Christ was to further his kingdom. And the more fully believers encountered the presence of Christ in their lives, the more they progressed toward the coming of his kingdom. On the day of the resurrection, Jesus appeared to his disciples and entrusted them with his mission. "As the Father sent me," he said, "so I send you." They were now to disclose to the whole world that all of the preparation and all of the prelude of God at work in history was now coming about to bring God's kingdom into being. This mission has continued through the life of the church, which means the year that we're entering is one year that we're closer to the complete fulfilling of God's promise. At least we're 1 year closer than last year was. We're the product of God's initiative in the world from those who share the faith with us and form the world we live in. And we're all part of the initiative for the world by living the faith and by sharing it with others. This means everything we do is challenged to be a part of bringing the kingdom of God to fulfillment in the world. We're on our way somewhere. We're not just swirling around in circles, the products of time and tragedy. We're participants in the work of God in the world, not victims or bystanders. As we look at the prospect of what is to come, we know it's in our hands. We can't see what the future will be, and we don't know what God in the divine providence will achieve. But our work is always to participate in making the kingdom of God present. Many people want to translate this into politics. And because this is an election year coming up, there will be endless calls from all sides that we have to vote one way or another if we're going to be faithful to our vocation of living out God's kingdom among us. And we don't exempt ourselves from political questions. In fact, we are to be participants in our society. We're not allowed to pretend as if the politics of the moment don't matter. They do matter. because they're the means by which our will and our vision are translated into action. It makes a difference how we vote and what we enable by our decisions. But we have to be cautious. Politics can swirl into the worst whirlpool of exploitation and foolishness that anyone can imagine. It's the easiest moment to become captivated by who's winning and who's losing, by who's up and who's down. At the same time, it's constantly moving. There's nothing that's simply done in the political life. Everything continues, and every part of our common life is a portion of the politics of the everyday. So we're constantly challenged to bring our decisions to the forum and to enact what is valuable and important. Public engagement never changes, and its challenge never disappears. Remember, the word politics comes from the word polis, which means city. And just as any city, nothing is ever just done and forgotten about. The trash has to be picked up, the roads have to be repaved, the drains have to be cleared, and the trees have to be watered. A city in which everyone simply lives there with no concern for maintaining it, that city is called a ruin. Political life is exactly the same way. It has to be sustained continually. And that's what this year is going to be like. We can look forward to all of the changes of living in a world that changes and develops and regresses and collapses in succession and all at once. We'll be tempted repeatedly to fix our eyes on some spot in the rapidly changing and passing of events and people, always with the promise that this person or this policy or this success or this failure will define our world and define our lives. Then we'll be challenged to remember that our lives are not defined by such things. We are to keep our eyes fixed on the presence of Christ among us, inviting us to be His real presence in the world, in a world that's realizing His true purpose and His will in it. The new year is the year in which we become more truly aware that God is with us and we are His. We no doubt will have the need to remember this over and over, but be assured we are closer to the fullness of Christ among us now than we have ever been before. So we have to be ready. It's the new year. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called, Is Anyone Real Anymore? Is anyone who he really says he is? The same for the she's in society. With all of the contemporary plagiarism biz, is this how we cope with our anxiety? By wearing the convenient mask we've picked up and placed easily upon our faces to get past any foolish error or hiccup, blurring all embarrassing smudge or traces. We all understand, we all strive to become the one we want to be in the end. No limit of someone's daughter, someone's son, even at the price it may misplace or offend. There's nothing new here in such situations. We've seen the conundrum 100 times. Shakespeare would know its insinuations. Dostoevsky too looks, seeks, sees, and finds. Finally, as we come to the final measure of one who and what and how we are to be, the one final truth, the greatest treasure, is that we cannot but know when we see. For at last, to open the most hidden lock, there is only one way for us, this one sure key, a foundation built firmly on deepest rock. Whatever the mask, wherever, I am me. That is anyone real anymore? The challenge remains that our life of faith is lived. We don't call it a life of faith for nothing. That's why we continue to invite you to join us in the future here on Living Catholic. Hope that you join us then.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.